Good morning, class, and welcome to MCO7 Collaborative and Competency-Based Approaches. And we're into Lecture 6, and we're going to get into narrative therapy. And my name's Dallas Bentley. So welcome to you all. So with narrative therapy, we have some of the pictures of some of the originators here. So we have Gregory Bateson, Michael White, and David Epstein. Okay. So if we look at Gregory Bateson, we're going to pick up the story because it's all about stories with narrative therapy. Okay. So Bateson, who was he? So if we look at, some of the basic tenets, okay, narrative therapy in the modern era springs forth sort of onto the scene in the modern era from ideas introduced to the world by Gregory Bateson, okay? And his contribution included research into linguistics, on systems theory and cybernetics, okay? And so what does this really mean? We've got linguistics, we've got systems theory and cybernetics, okay? So basically what it means is that the idea is that the individuals in society are a part of a system, yes, which can serve to reinforce the relationships, the behaviors, and the people's problem stories that they have. Okay, so this is some of the basic tenets of where narrative therapy comes from. Okay. So Bateson said that Bateson brought together social and behavioral sciences, systems theory, animal, machine control, and communications. And I've just got a student there that may have your microphone on, and we're just getting a little bit of feedback. If I could just ask you to turn that off, please. Thank you. So Bateson brought together social and behavioral sciences, systems theory, animal machine control, and communications, which is what cybernetics is. Okay, well before I studied narrative therapy at university in the Masters of Counselling that I did here in Queensland, cybernetics for me was the Terminator, right? So, but this is a true account of what cybernetics is, okay? So he also cited the works of Barbara Meyerhoff, Jerome Bruner, and Edward Bruner, and Ken Gergen. Okay, and so he was drawing on their ideas. This is very important. So the basic tenets of narrative therapy, basic tenets and ideas of narrative therapy is the philosophy, sociology, and social psychology. Okay, so we're looking at these three. Okay. Michael White and David Epstein consider therapy a construct based in social meaning, making, and post-structuralist philosophy, okay? And their approach is the foundation of modern narrative practice, okay? So they they explain how they're not interested in calling their work narrative therapy. And the reason that they do this is that they don't want to name the process. Because in naming things, see, this is one of the most fundamental tenets and basic principles of narrative is that when you name things, yes, that in itself can have its own problem or problematic type of association. Okay, so in the naming process, it has the problems, and to name these ideas and ways of practice under such a name will make it structuralist. Okay, it will make it a structuralist enterprise. Okay, and we're going to get into that a little bit later in the lecture. Okay, but their chosen terminology is narrative ways of practice and narrative ideas or narrative work. Okay, so that's very important. So Michael White and David Epstein, they created the Dulwich Centre in Australia, in Adelaide. Okay, so Michael's from Australia, David's from New Zealand, and they believe that therapy can be a respectful, non-blaming approach to counselling, which centres people as the experts in their lives, okay? So as a counsellor, yeah, you're not the expert, okay? The client's the expert, okay? So this is where in post-structuralist thinking, in narrative therapy, where there's a little bit of an overlap with solution-focused therapy, okay? And with systems theory, okay? So narrative therapy views problems as separate. Okay, so you have the individual and you have the problem. Okay, so they're separate from people and assumes that people have many skills, many competencies, beliefs, values, commitments, and abilities. Okay, and this can assist them or assist your clients to reduce the influence of problems or problematic behavior in their lives. Okay. So within the same frame of, it's within the same frame of solution-focused therapy, as I was just alluding to there. Yeah. And narrative therapy encourages counselors, to maintain a stance of curiosity. Yeah. The abundant, genuine curiosity about an individual. Yes. So this is where this distinction in narrative therapy, where we're making a clear distinction between narrative therapy, which is in postmodernism. Yeah. So postmodernism is this falls under the banner of postmodernism. Currently in the world, postmodernism as a philosophy has a lot of problems. Okay, but I'm not going to be able to get into the problematic aspects of postmodernism in the current society right now, because that would be another 2-hour lecture. Okay, but it's very important to make that distinction. Okay. And it's really important when we're studying a certain philosophy to be able to see the strengths and limitations, and understand those. Okay. So Michael White and David Epstein, they wanted to ask questions to which, we genuinely do not know the answers. Okay. A not knowing position of inquiry. Yes. So you don't know. You don't make assumptions. You don't say, if you get a client that has a diagnosis, or ADHD, this kind of thing, you read it, but you put it, you read it, and then you maybe turn the page over and put it on your desk, and you talk to a person like a human being. Okay, this is one of the really good things, and one of the things I like about narrative therapy. So Michael White and David Epstein also believed that what was unique to narrative therapy is the assumption that people construct stories or narratives of their lives, which shape how they see themselves, yes, and live their lives, yes. And they also, have the assumption that, problems occur when a person's dominant story, yeah. So what's your dominant story of who you are, yeah, and what's the dominant story of who the client is, okay, is saturated with many negative experiences, okay. And if you think about that, it's true. There's a lot of truth in that. We all have positive and negative experiences, but we have a lot of negative experiences in life, okay? And the association of the negative experiences as a living human person, you have memories, you have images, and you have judgments of others and of yourself, okay? So where does this all lead to? It's the narrative, okay? So the narrative is a dominant story that brings a client to therapy, yeah? And it is the story that clients begin to recount to the counsellor in the first session is often thin in content, in that it overlooks the complexities and contradictions of a person's life. Okay, so these are these thin descriptions, which we're going to be talking about in next week's lecture as well. We're going to be digging a little bit deeper into what thin descriptions are, okay? So just as an overview of thin descriptions here, not only are these descriptions disrespectful to oneself, they overlook positive aspects of the self, are limiting, and they affect how individuals will act in the future. Okay, so when you're dealing with a client, they have these thin descriptions of themselves, surface level thin, okay? And then these clients can also overlook the social oppression that they suffer. Because with narrative therapy, remember, we're really taking into account, the social context or the social environment in which an individual lives. Okay, this is sort of a part of postmodernist thought. Okay, so whenever you're socially oppressed, you suffer. Okay, there's some suffering going on. Yeah, so clients can overlook this, and this contributes to their life narrative. And in this sense, narrative therapy differs. So there's this differentiation. Even though there's overlaps, there's differentiation from solution-focused approaches in its awareness of social inequalities and how they play out in people's lives. Okay, so that's a little bit about the the differences with what we've been talking about in the first couple of lectures this semester. Okay. So also with narrative therapy, it's about rewriting your personal history. Okay. And narrative therapy calls on us to examine more than the immediate circumstances, so what's going on in a client's life and the difficulties, and to take a view of a client's overall history. Yeah, so we kind of want to know what happened in the past. We want to know what's happening now. We want to know what's happening in the future. Okay, so this is when it says overall history. Yeah. So when a client comes in and the individual problems have endured for some time, their whole identity is this whole that problem-saturated types of stories, that you may you definitely come across if you're doing counselling with people. There'll be a problem-saturated elements to their story that they're telling you. Okay, and in this, the image that others have of them, so they have an image and other people have of them, and often the image they hold of themselves becomes saturated with the story. They become embedded and saturated. Excuse me, okay? And they are seen in terms of being mad, bad, or sad. Okay? Yeah. And while there are many other skills and qualities are often overlooked, and we get this from Perry, 1999. Therefore, we need to find ways to rewrite the story of who they are. Okay? Who are you? If you haven't got your problem-saturated story, then who are you really? So in this, the counsellor will need to look for instances when the clients display opposite qualities to the problem. And an example of this might be a child, who does not persist at schoolwork, but may be diligent when practicing soccer. Okay, certainly my son was like that. Like he was a little bit of a class clown. I'm not sure where he gets that from, but he was really, really good at soccer. Okay. And this tells us that the client can persist and therefore does not need to invent that ability, but only needs to transfer it from soccer field to the classroom. Yeah, and he's done that. My son, he's on his way to university. So what does this all mean for the role of the therapist? Okay, this is what we really need to know. So we talked about a little bit of the history, a little bit of the philosophy, a little bit of some of the basic tenets of narrative therapy, where it comes from and some sort of things, but how do we apply it, in relation to you as a therapist, okay? So the therapist's role is to create opportunities for reauthoring conversations that seek to reconstruct alternative stories, okay? And this is why this is underlined. So you're reconstructing the alternative stories, yeah, that are identified by our clients as stories by which they would prefer to live their lives, okay? And we want to know about their preferred accounts of these particular stories, okay? So that's sort of the first thing. So the second thing is the deconstruction of the story. So we deconstruct the story and then we reconstruct an alternative story. The client's in front of us and we're deconstructing what they're saying a little in the questions that we ask, which are very specific in narrative therapy that we'll be speaking about next week. And then we reconstruct the alternative story, okay? So in deconstructing and reconstructing the alternative story, we need to know that people live the preferred accounts of their stories. Yeah, we want them to live preferred accounts, yeah? And we've spoken a little bit about post-structuralism in counselling. What does that mean? So essentially, it's a study of language acquisition. Yeah, so babies can generalise sounds when they're very small. Yeah, and they average their meanings from the sounds. Okay, and if we remember our friend Bateson from earlier on in the lecture, he wrote about this self-regulating systems, and this is really, really important in narrative therapy. Okay, so that if we orientate ourselves to an alternative story, then that can be a self-regulating process for us, okay? So also, there's these multi-stories, okay? And certainly Michael White and David Epstein had a lot of success in working with Indigenous people in Australia, where there's an oral history and where the language is culture, So this is where we have this term song lines. And again, I don't have a lot of time in this particular lecture to talk about song lines and Indigenous song lines. I could probably fill up another hour or two in my knowledge about those particular aspects. but just something for you to consider. Okay. So deconstruction of questions. How do we do that? Okay. So the deconstruction questions are designed in narrative therapy to sort of expose the client's problematic beliefs, their practice, their feelings, and their attitudes. So we've got the beliefs, the practice, the feelings, and the attitudes. And some of these types of questions may include, that you might ask, what conclusions have you drawn about yourself because of this problem? Yeah. Does the problem encourage particular feelings in your life? And what gets in the way of your preferred way of being? Okay. So these are very, very classic types of narrative therapy questions. Okay. So there's externalization going on, essentially. Okay. So if we have a little bit of a look now at the story, because we're talking about narrative therapy, which basically means a story. Okay. And just to sort of sum up a little bit of what I've been talking about. So it's a philosophical approach. Yeah. Social constructionist and post-structuralist, are a part of narrative therapy. Yeah. And it's a way the narrative therapist has of understanding human experience. Okay. As a narrative therapist, we also understand that people live storied lives, and they link events across time. So if you think in yourself, in your memory, you'll have different things in time that you'll try and be linking. Yeah. From the time that you were a child, depending on how much your memory goes back, to sort of where you are now. Okay. And there's different plots and, twists and turns along the way, and that makes up your life story. Okay. So when we have the conversations, we're continually constructing our realities. This is where post-structuralism and postmodernism comes in. Okay. So in postmodernism, there's this belief that we construct our reality through language. Okay. And then there's the preferred stories. So, let's have a little bit of a look at options for telling and retelling of the story. And let's look for options for the performance, yes, of the story, yes, where you're the main character or your client's the main character. And then there are a re-performance. Yeah, so this is, again, looking at an alternative story, okay? So in narrative therapy, the person is not the problem is the problem. This is a very famous saying from Michael White. And if you had a chance to have a little bit of a look at the video, I think he says it in there. That's one of his famous sayings. Okay, and people live with many types of different stories. Okay, but again, the stories, when you're meeting with clients, they can be problem saturated a lot of the time. Okay, or even in your own life, your own mind, problem saturated stories will come up. Yeah, and it can be difficult to get rid of them sometimes. Okay. So in the stories we tell ourselves, they're the stories we tell ourselves about our experience. This is the experience that we're having. Yeah. So the initial role for counselors in narrative therapy, is to think about this externalization. Okay, externalizing the problem. Okay. And in this, there's a thing called the storied life. Okay. So again, the therapist's role and the task is to find the dominant influences on the current plot that the person's telling themselves or your client is telling themselves, And you're looking at the story and the chapter in the person's life, okay? So again, just to reiterate, problems are constructed in a social, it's really important with narrative therapy, there's a social context, there's a cultural context, and there's a political context, okay? Social, cultural, political, yes? And all of these things serve as the basis, for the stories, okay? So this essentially means that there's a multiplicity of experience, okay? And the elements of experience are understood only through a process that organizes those elements, it puts them together, and it assigns meaning here, meaning there, So basically there's multiple ways of doing this, okay? So if we look at mapping in narrative practice, Martin Luther King stated that the salvation of the world lies in the maladjusted. And Bill O'Hanlon, who's the solution, who's kind of like the vanguard for possibility therapy, which sits in solution focused therapy from our last 5 weeks. He thinks White and Epstein are under the influence of optimism. I think he's right with how they think believe that a person's problems are social and personal constructions, not the person themselves. Okay, so again, the person isn't the problem. It's if you think about it, we're individuals and there's a society there. Society has problems, we have problems, but how do we differentiate? How do we get out of that problem-saturated story that society is telling us? Okay, it can be quite challenging. So this is a little bit of an interesting slide. It's getting a little bit more technical here, okay, but I'll just sort of briefly go over this. And certainly I'll be putting up the PowerPoint slide into the help pages this afternoon. So you can do your own work, but I'll just give you a basic overview of what this slide means. So essentially in the middle, and you'll be working on this, we'll do a little bit more on this next week, and you'll be working on it in the residential schools. If narrative therapy is the type of framework that perhaps you'd like to try, okay, in some of the times in which you do have time to practice some of the skills. So you have the client in the middle, okay, and there's all these different aspects of what's happening for them, yeah, and you can see that very clearly on the slide. So maybe take a little bit of time to reflect on that, okay? Maybe this is a representation in some form of where your life is at the moment, okay? Yeah. So we need to look at these now, okay? So if we get all these different little problems, this is how we're kind of mapping in narrative therapy, and we're organizing these elements, okay? We break them down a little bit. Yeah, and we get the client to sort of give us like a running order of what's a priority. And once we get a client to give us a bit of an idea about what the running priority of these elements are, then we can start to address them. Okay. And we do this through externalization. So externalizing the problem, which is a really big thing in narrative therapy, okay? So when we externalize, in externalizing practice, when we're putting the theory into actual practice with a person, there's this, this objectivity and the personification of a problem to disempower it, okay? So you objectify and personify the problem to disempower it, okay? We discover unique outcomes through that. So, it runs, there's a very deliberate way of externalizing problems. So there's the practice, yeah, and then there's the unique outcomes, yes, and then there's the thickening of the alternative stories, yes. So we're talking a little bit before about, a thin story, so we want to thicken that, yeah. And it's not necessarily a technique. So this is where the challenges come for students, for people, for myself. It's not a technique, it's more of a, it's a philosophy, emphasizes language and meaning, okay? So it can be a little bit challenging to get your head around at the beginning, okay? But this is just a basic overview,